Being president is like being a jackass in a hailstorm. There's nothing to do but to stand there and take it. Lyndon B. Johnson.
Oh, hi. Mr. Lahasky here, and today we'll take a look at the social reform programs of the 1960s, also known as the Great Society. In popular memory, the 1960s is dominated by the Vietnam War and the counterculture surrounding it. And indeed, the conflict in Southeast Asia caused turmoil at home and tragedy overseas. But in the shadow of the Cold War, Lyndon B. Johnson's federal government was taking unprecedented steps to remedy many of society's ills. Racial injustice and poverty were focal points of this effort, which he dubbed the Great Society. Today, we'll look a little closer at LBJ's oft-forgotten domestic policies, and we'll try to answer a big question. Does Lyndon B. Johnson's failures in Vietnam overshadow the domestic successes of his Great Society? Scholars generally agree that the Vietnam War was a disastrous chapter in American history. The United States lost nearly 60,000 soldiers in an unwinnable war, then watched as communism spread through Indochina. The government betrayed the trust of the American people, and social unrest brought the nation to the brink of collapse. But the 1960s also witnessed major victories in domestic programs. Two major civil rights acts in 1964 and 1965 ultimately brought the Jim Crow era to an end. Medicare and Medicaid rendered medical care accessible to millions of uninsured people, and public education was guaranteed by the federal government. But is there room in LBJ's story to celebrate these victories, or will his legacy be forever tarnished by the missteps in Vietnam? Let's look inside the Great Society, then you decide. Our first big idea provides the historical context needed for the exploration of LBJ's domestic policies. John F. Kennedy's popularity, combined with his tragic assassination, provided Lyndon B. Johnson with vast political capital, which he employed to launch an ambitious reform effort known as the Great Society. The 1960 presidential election pitted Republican Richard Nixon, a former senator and vice president to Dwight Eisenhower, against a striking young newcomer named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Nixon was an experienced politician, well-versed in policy, but Kennedy was young, handsome, and frankly, much better on television. The 1960 election featured the first nationally televised debate between presidential candidates, and Kennedy's performance helped lift him ahead of Richard Nixon. Kennedy assumed the presidency and, soon after, captured the country's imagination. For many Americans, Kennedy represented the United States' bright future. Sure, there were volatile moments like the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, but Kennedy also inspired a generation by setting into motion an ambitious space program and taking initial but important steps towards civil rights. By the numbers, he remains the most popular president of the modern era. When Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, the entire nation stood in shock. The vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, took the presidential oath of office on Air Force One only an hour after learning that the president had died. Standing at his side was Jackie Kennedy, still wearing the infamous pink Chanel suit stained with her husband's blood. It was a visceral moment, captured by presidential photographer Cecil Stofton. Johnson promised Mrs. Kennedy to carry on her husband's legacy. In a later statement, he asked the American people and God for help in this endeavor. While the nation did not yet know the direction Johnson would take the country, the memory of John F. Kennedy and the blessings of Jackie gave him a measure of sympathy with the American people, and it gave him political capital with Congress. Johnson announced his intentions in May 1964. In a commencement speech at the University of Michigan, Johnson outlined a vision for what he called the Great Society. Take a listen.
Your imagination and your initiative and your indignation will determine whether we build a society where progress is the servant of our needs, or a society where old values and new visions are buried under unbridled growth. For in your time, we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society. The great society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.
While Johnson lacked Kennedy's charisma, he shared in his visionary qualities. Johnson believed that America was uniquely poised to end society's ills. Chief among them were racial injustice, poverty, and inequality in education. He directed Congress to pass a slate of programs to this end. This is our second big idea. Johnson's Great Society represented the most significant peacetime expansion of government since the New Deal. It included laws and programs that aimed to improve race relations, bolster public education, and end poverty. LBJ's Great Society took the form of over 200 pieces of legislation between 1964 and 1968, and they were sweeping in size and scope. Among the first areas of emphasis for the Great Society was racial injustice. By the mid-1960s, the modern civil rights movement had gained significant momentum. Between 1964 and 1968, Johnson signed a number of landmark bills intended to bring the Jim Crow era to an end. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made segregation illegal in all public places, including restaurants and hotels. In the same year, the 24th Amendment abolished poll taxes, which had disenfranchised blacks in the South since Reconstruction. In 1965, African Americans' voting rights were protected further with the Voting Rights Act, which eliminated literacy tests and helped black people in the South register to vote for the first time. The last major piece of civil rights legislation came in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act, which attempted to end redlining by outlawing prejudicial housing policies. Another area of emphasis for Johnson's Great Society was poverty. Despite the booming economy of the 50s, more than 40 million Americans lived below the poverty line at the beginning of the 1960s. In 1964, Johnson announced an unconditional war on poverty, and Congress supported the effort. During the next 4 years, government spending on programs to help the poor doubled. The Office of Economic Opportunity was created to direct the effort, but independent legislation also aimed to lift people from economic despair. The Food Stamp Act provided food aid for low-income Americans. Medicaid provided health insurance for the poor, and Medicare did the same for the elderly. The Child Nutrition Act added breakfast to school lunch programs, so children in poverty would have access to more than a single meal on school days. These and other welfare programs did have a measurable effect, as the poverty rate was cut nearly in half between 1964 and 1968. But Johnson's Great Society also attempted to improve educational opportunities in the United States. The Head Start program provided free preschool for low-income families. In 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act gave states money to invest in educational programs and provided federal assistance to low-income school districts. And the Higher Education Act of 1965 provided scholarships for students to attend college. As a former teacher himself, Johnson recognized that to truly end poverty and economic destitution, a robust public education system was necessary. Other noteworthy Great Society programs included a new Immigration Act that ended the racially driven quota system that had been established with the help of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. Environmental concerns were raised with the Clean Air Act, which attempted to address air pollution on a regional basis. And Johnson also bolstered media and the arts. The Public Broadcasting Act appropriated funds to non-commercial television and radio, giving rise to NPR and PBS. The Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts was another Great Society project, as was the National Endowment for the Humanities, which funds artistic and cultural projects across the country. Like the New Deal, the Great Society consisted of more programs than we can possibly list here. It also resulted in a significant expansion of the federal government's responsibility and its authority. And this drew criticism from Republicans who feared the U.S. was turning into a welfare state. But How successful were the programs of the Great Society? Let's take a look with our final big idea. The legacy of Johnson's Great Society is mixed. While some Great Society programs showed promise, they competed with the Vietnam War for attention and funds. Historical scholarship remains divided on the Great Society. While civil rights legislation did not address structural economic inequality, it did provide a legal basis for the dignity and social liberties that had long been denied to African Americans. The environmental efforts of the Great Society were themselves ineffective, but they laid important groundwork for more meaningful environmental policy in the 1970s and beyond. And while Johnson didn't succeed in eradicating hunger and illiteracy, poverty did decrease dramatically during his presidency. However, his efforts to this end faced a kind of self-sabotage, as LBJ's administration diverted funds from the war on poverty to the war in Vietnam, drawing criticism from members of his own party. And all this brings us back to our big question. Is Johnson's legacy salvageable? The Vietnam War was an unmitigated disaster, one for which the American people have never really forgiven the government. But the Great Society undoubtedly made the country a better place for large swaths of its people. This question reminds us that judging presidents, past or present, is an inexact science. Every president has their victories and their defeats. And it just so happens that LBJ had a lot of both. As for where Lyndon B. Johnson ranks in the pantheon of American presidents, well, that debate rages on. Next time, we'll take an overdue look at the modern civil rights movement. See you then.